I saved that man with my own hands. And only years later did I realize that I had taken care of my brother's killer. It wasn't his file that made me hesitate. It was the absence of it. It was as if he didn't exist. No name, no origins, no recorded past. But his skin trembled with cold like anyone else's. His blood dripped onto the floor in the same way. And his eyes held something I'd never seen before. Or maybe I'd seen them and forced myself to forget. I knelt without thinking. There were screams all around, sirens, someone pulling me by the arm. But my hands were already on him, helping, holding, choosing. They say there are moments when the soul recognizes before the heart, and I swear by everything I have left that night, I only saw a wounded man, a survivor, someone who needed me. I hid him where no one was looking, washed his wounds with warm water, invented a name, gave him my food, and I remained silent. A heavy silence, sewn into my throat like the stitches I closed in his body. A silence that has stayed with me to this day. It wasn't until decades later, when I found a forgotten box, a letter I'd never opened, and a name that had come back from the depths of time, that everything fell apart, everything connected. And what was simply an act of compassion became a wound deeper than any I've ever treated. Because the man I saved was the same one who took my brother from me. And there's no scalpel in the world that can undo that. My name is Geneva Blanche Tillman. I'm 87 years old. I live alone in a disused orphanage here in Pittsburgh, a place that was once filled with voices, hurried footsteps, and tiny hands tugging at my skirts, asking for bread or a cuddle. Today it's all wind, memories, and the smell of curtains no one cleans anymore. Sometimes the floor creaks at night, as if to remind me I'm still here. Other times I forget I'm alive until I hear the sound of my own sigh. About that story. I never told it. Not when people asked about the war. Not when they mentioned my brother. And not even when I dreamed of that man's face so many nights in a row that I began to forget my own. But now, with that letter on the table still closed, still waiting to be read, I felt I should. That maybe one of you somewhere in this world might understand. Or at least hear. It's not easy to remember, but it's harder to hide. Comment here where you're listening from. I want to know how far my voice can still reach. And if this story touches you in any way, subscribe to the channel. There are certain memories only a grandmother can share, and certain pains that only those who have experienced war carry quietly. I was a camp nurse in Czechoslovakia in the months following the liberation of the prison camps. I wasn't drafted. I volunteered. Maybe out of patriotism. Maybe out of loneliness. Maybe out of guilt. My brother Samuel had been sent months earlier and never returned. My only bond. My only name to speak aloud. We arrived in a cold autumn with a perpetually gray sky. The hospital was makeshift, with crooked iron beds, stained blankets, and the constant smell of dried blood mixed with cheap disinfectant. Some arrived walking, others were dragged. There were survivors of every possible war, the war with the enemy, the war with the cold, the war with hunger, and the war within, which didn't show up on the x-rays. I was quick, precise. I learned to recognize when someone wasn't going to make it before I touched them. But there were others, those who seemed to be alive only out of stubbornness. And it was there, among them, that I found the wounded man who wasn't on the list. The box was dark wood, with chipped corners and moth marks on the sides. I kept it hidden under my iron bed, along with other remnants of myself. A handkerchief embroidered with my initials, a zipperless brooch, a button from a soldier's coat I never knew whose. On the lid of the box was a faded blue ribbon, still tied neatly. I knew what was inside. I'd known for decades. But I didn't touch it. I didn't read it. I didn't move it. See you this morning. The sun streamed in through the half-open window, tracing a golden line across the wooden floor. It was as if that beam of light had been pointed directly at the box. I stood up slowly, my body demanding silence with every articulation. I bent down with effort and pulled the past out from under the bed. I sat on the edge and left the box on my lap. Dust rose like a pent-up sigh. My fingers searched for the brass latch that had never worked properly. And when I opened it, the smell came first. Old paper, dampened by time, and the memories that had never left me alone. There were photos, Christmas cards, a note signed by a little girl I lost in the hospital, written in colored pencil. And among all this, a letter, a manila envelope, folded with extreme care, sealed with a thin ribbon. On the back, the name handwritten, Samuel Tillman, my brother. My heart skipped a beat. It was his handwriting, firm, slanted, just like him. I knew every curve, every space between the letters. But that letter, I had never opened it. Never. And it wasn't because I didn't want to. It was because, deep down, I always knew it wouldn't bring relief. Only more questions, or more pain. For a moment, I stood there simply holding it, watching. The weight of the letter seemed greater than its contents, as if it carried within it something that could alter the course of the memories I'd worked so hard to keep quiet. The wind outside pushed back the curtain, and a thread of light flickered over the envelope. It was as if time itself had held its breath. But I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, my eyes fell on something else inside the box. A torn piece of newspaper, with a partially faded photo, and a name circled in blue ink. Martin A. Gellert. The circled handwriting was my own. I remembered doing it. One sleepless night, years after the war, when my memory betrayed me and sent me searching for clues. And it was seeing that name again that the images began to return, not in an orderly fashion. They came like the bursting of an old dam, without logic, without compassion. The hospital, the cold, the smell of metal and open flesh, the man on the stretcher, his silence, the false name, and the bracelet. My chest tightened, because before I understood clearly, my soul already knew. That letter, that name, and that man were connected. And if I truly wanted to continue, if I were truly going to open it, I would have to go back. Not just in time, but to the exact moment it all began. The night I found the injured man who wasn't on the list. I remember the first time I set foot on that foreign soil, like someone remembering their own baptism. There was a thin layer of snow on the ground, but the chill that ran through me wasn't from the weather. It was something else. A chill of absence, of everything that had already happened there before I arrived. The train station felt like an exhausted body. Damp wood, a broken roof, smoke in the air that came not from bonfires but from train cars that had transported more horrors than anyone could count. Every track was a cut, every bench, a memory forgotten by someone who might no longer exist. And there I was, with my canvas suitcase, my polished shoes, and my courage still intact, perhaps out of ignorance. The hospital wasn't a hospital. It was an abandoned school, its windows blown out and desks stacked against the walls, as if trying to block out the past were possible, with old furniture. The hallways still had chalkboards hanging, but now they were used to write down the names of the dead and the temperatures of the feverish. We slept in makeshift bunk beds, each with a thin blanket and a different nightmare. There was always a lingering smell in the air, a mixture of ether, sweat, smoke, and something no one could name. Maybe fear. The strangest thing was the silence. Not the peaceful silence, but the one that comes after the scream. The children didn't cry. The adults didn't speak. The soldiers avoided eye contact. Those who arrived were wrapped in torn blankets or hastily torn off civilian clothes. Many were camp survivors. Some just said so. It was impossible to tell. Most came without documents, without names, without records. Literally disappeared. And what I had been taught to record as identity crumbled before them. In the first week, I lost 2 men and a woman under my care. Not through failure, but through time. They had been wounded before me, forgotten before I could do anything. Holding their hands was the most I could offer. I learned to listen to their last breath as if listening to a prayer. And when I washed their bodies, I did so in silence. Each stained sheet was a new page in what would become my war story. It was there that I learned to live with the inexplicable, that I understood that not everything you do right is fair, and not everything that seems wrong is cruel. Sometimes the choices we make in seconds become secrets we carry for decades. And in that icy Czechoslovakia, among cracked corridors and beds without names, something inside me broke. But also, something was born. On the 3rd night, the infirmary radio announced that Sam, my brother, had been officially declared dead. And I remember standing for a few seconds in front of the basin of blood from another man I didn't even know. The water still swirled, red, hot. And inside me, something froze. I didn't cry. Not that day. I just kept washing, as if that were the only way to not forget, or to keep myself whole. And perhaps that's why, when I saw that man dragged inside one dark morning, days later, nameless, uninjured, unregistered, I moved before I thought, because not all the missing had left, and not all those who returned should have returned. That early morning had a kind of darkness that seemed thicker than usual. The candles were almost gone, and the light in the main corridor had been flickering for days without anyone having the time or energy to change it. The sound of the wind scratched the windows like a locked child's fingernails. I was on duty alone in that ward, the one for the most serious cases, those who couldn't be moved or who were waiting for death. I often said to myself that that corridor was the last breath before oblivion. I heard a shuffling noise at the back entrance. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes soldiers would bring in wounded men in the middle of the night, without warning, without records, without anything. But that sound, there was something different about it. It wasn't the sound of duty. It was the sound of guilt. I went to the door, grabbed the flashlight, and descended the 2 steps into the foyer. And that's when I saw him. 2 men left him on the ground and ran off without a word. No names, no orders, no records. Just a body lying on the icy floor, drenched in blood and snow. It was as if they'd gotten rid of something, not handed someone over to be saved. I bent down. He was breathing. Weakly, but breathing. He had a deep cut on the left side of his abdomen, another on his thigh, and the fingers of his right hand were broken, already beginning to swell. But his eyes were open, and they looked at me, not with pleading, not with fear, but with recognition, as if he already knew me, as if he knew I was coming, or as if he was waiting just for me. I searched for his file for the next few minutes. I searched the intake clipboard, the transfer box, the ledger board hanging on the wall next to the stairs. Nothing. No name. No number. No trace. The man bleeding in front of me officially didn't exist. I went back to him. This was more than a breach of protocol. It was an erasure. And erasure in war usually hid something bigger. Soldiers in fear, deserters, men who saw or did things that couldn't be recorded. But there were also survivors no one wanted to welcome, because knowing about them meant remembering what had been done. I knelt there for long seconds, the sound of the infirmary clock marking each beat of my heart. I should report it. I knew it. But I didn't move, because something inside me whispered that this moment wouldn't be resolved with a form. And maybe because my eyes had already memorized his face, and an ancient silent part of my soul already knew he wasn't just a wounded man. He was a choice. I dragged him to the abandoned wing at the back of the hospital, where no one had been since the beginning of winter. The beds were covered with dusty sheets. There was a broken window with a cloth nailed over it, and an old stove that barely worked. I laid him down carefully. I removed his soaked shirt. I washed his wounds. I bandaged each part as if caring for something sacred. And then, with his eyes still closed, he whispered, "Thank you, Miss Tillman." My blood ran cold. He knew my name. But I had never seen that man before in my life. Or at least, that's what I thought. There are faces we never forget, even if we try, even if we have to. And sometimes there are faces we don't immediately recognize, but that evoke an old shiver, as if something inside us has cried for them before. That night, when I knelt beside him for the first time, I still thought he was just another war-wounded body. But he wasn't. There was a tension in his features that held me captivated. His thick brows, his chiseled jaw, the gaping gash above his left eyebrow. Everything about him seemed to hold a story that refused to die. The blood trickled slowly, and yet he kept his eyes half closed, as if struggling not to see too much of me. I washed the wound with warm water, the steam rising between us like a veil. He didn't complain of the pain. He didn't scream. He just breathed deeply, his lips parted, his eyes fixed on mine. It was as if there were a pact there, born without words. I would care for him, and he wouldn't tell me who he was. I carefully wiped gauze over the side of my face. It was the first time I'd noticed that small old scar near my ear. Not from a bullet. It was a knife mark, perhaps from a fight. I thought about asking, but my mouth fell silent. He clutched the sheet with his good hand, and his other hand, the broken one, seemed to protect his chest, as if he wanted to keep something from getting out, not in. His instinct wasn't to survive. It was to avoid discovery. As I stitched up the wound in her abdomen, I noticed her gaze shifting between me and the covered window, as if she were afraid someone was watching us. And what disturbed me most was the fact that I was calm, not scared, not suspicious. It was as if I'd been waiting for this moment my whole life, even without knowing it. I finished the dressing with a clean cloth and made a makeshift pillow out of my own folded coat. I touched his forehead with the back of my hand. It burned, but it wasn't just a fever. There was a dense heat emanating from him, as if his presence altered the air in the room. Before leaving the ward, I turned off the only overhead light and left only a lamp burning on the floor. He was asleep now, and there, in the darkness, with the sound of the wind outside and the flame flickering on the wall, I found myself sitting on the floor for some unknown length of time, watching the man who shouldn't be there, the man with no record, no name, the man whose face disturbed me for a reason I still couldn't name. But my body knew, my bones, my skin, they knew. And something inside me, silent as a buried memory, began to whisper. In the hospital, everything had its order. Even in the chaos, each patient was numbered, each vial of morphine counted, each death recorded with time, cause, and witness. I followed this system with almost religious precision. It was my way of carrying on. But that morning, after seeing him sleeping, after that whisper that pierced pain and silence, I knew I had crossed an invisible boundary. I returned to the abandoned ward with a basket of clean clothes on my arm, as if it were just another round. But inside, every step felt like a betrayal, a theft from myself. When I opened the door and saw him awake, sitting on the gurney with his eyes glazed over the boarded-up window, I felt as if my conscience was sitting beside me, watching me too. He tried to get up, but the pain knocked him back down. The fever was still burning. I approached slowly, like someone approaching a secret, before deciding whether they really want to know it. I touched his shoulder. He didn't react. He just said a strange, low phrase. I wasn't supposed to come back. That sentence stuck with me like a thin thorn piercing the tissue without tearing. I didn't respond. I just started cleaning the gauze, checking the stitches, changing the bandage on his thigh. I did everything as I would with anyone else, but with an inexplicable care. He seemed more lucid now, but he avoided looking directly at me. I avoided questions too. Still, I decided he'd stay there, that no one else would know. I used the torn sheets as a divider, hanging them between the empty beds like makeshift curtains. At the back of the ward, there was an old cupboard that served as storage. I brought dry food, water, hidden morphine, and compresses there. I set up a small hiding place, not just for him, but for the silence. I made up a random name for the records. Patient 41B, transferred for outpatient treatment. I wrote it down on the ward's spreadsheet in my own handwriting. No superior would check it. Those days were too long for thorough inspections, and I knew how to look good. I learned early. That night I returned with a better blanket. He was awake, watching the flame of the lamp dance on the cracked walls. When he saw me enter, he let out a soft sigh, almost a relief, as if for some reason he'd already expected I wouldn't leave him. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice hoarse but firm. I stopped. I looked at him. I thought about responding with something rational, technical, or moral, but all I could manage was, because no one else did. And in that moment I saw his eyes fill with tears. But he didn't cry. Neither did I. We sat in silence, two survivors of choices we didn't yet understand. And in that hiding place behind the curtain, I began to lose the line between what was right and what was mine. Because there was something about him, something that was pulling me in. And I, against everything, was giving in. I've treated wounds of all kinds, bayonet-torn gashes, phosphorus burns, exposed fractures that smelled like dead bone. Some bled on the outside, others on the inside. But what he had was different. The skin did close over time, yes. But there was something open about him that no stitch could reach. Every time I examined him, I felt this sensation, as if something were missing from his structure. Not an organ, but a soullessness in some parts of his body. His skin clung to his bones, as if he had no will to be there. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if breathing were an unstable accord with the world. I began to notice small gestures. When I cleaned the wound on his thigh, he always glanced toward the door, as if waiting for someone to arrive and finish the job. When I changed the bandages on his abdomen, his eyes blinked slowly, as if apologizing for something they couldn't say. One particularly cold morning, I noticed the stitches had become inflamed. The surrounding skin was red, hot, and tense. Something wasn't right, despite all my care. And yet, he didn't complain. It was as if he felt he deserved the pain, that the pain was, in some way, just. That's when a frightening thought occurred to me. What if he'd done something terrible? Something unforgivable? That lack of records? It could be more than negligence. It could be intentional. A deliberate erasure. A diversion. A staged disappearance. But the next moment, seeing how he gripped the sheet with stiff fingers, like a sick child gripping the edge of the blanket when the nurse comes in. My heart sank again. War teaches us to distrust, but it also teaches us to love without logic. As I changed the bandages, I noticed a circular scar near his hip. Old, poorly healed, perhaps from a shrapnel wound. It wasn't in the usual places. It was more defensive, as if he'd thrown himself at something. Or someone. "Where was that?" I asked without thinking. He looked away. Silence. Then he answered with painful slowness. "It happened. Before." "Before what?" "Before the war. Before me. Before someone's death." I wanted to ask more, but I didn't. That night, while he slept, I sat on the cold floor of the abandoned ward with the medical record book on my lap. I wrote the following. Patient with no medical records. Deep wound. Unstable progression. Emotional prognosis. Closed. But something about him doesn't want to heal. I closed the notebook and left the sentence like that, because in that man, the most serious wound was the one he didn't let show. It took days for him to say anything beyond short moans or stray sentences. I didn't pressure him. War taught me that some words only come out when they find a safe body to rest, and even then, some words are only stillborn. It was on a leaden afternoon, the kind of light that turns everything gray and disorients time, that he finally spoke. I had brought him some thin soup and 2 pieces of stale bread. He accepted, ate in silence, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the bowl, as if he wanted to disappear with it. "Martin," he said suddenly, his voice catching in his throat. "What?" I asked, distracted. "My name. Martin." I didn't move. I just nodded. "Martin." I repeated as if testing a key in an old lock. He confirmed it with his gaze, but it was the kind of confirmation that doesn't convince a soul like mine. I said nothing. I didn't argue. I simply tucked that name away in a corner of my mind, far from real names, far from the ones that matter. That night I wrote Martin on a small piece of paper and tucked it between the pages of a medical book I kept on the back shelf. It was my way of sealing that lie with silence, and perhaps of protecting it from myself. Over the next few days he started talking a little more. Short sentences, comments about the weather, the occasional request for water. But nothing about where he came from. Nothing about what hurt him. Nothing about why you knew my name before you even heard me. I watched him carefully. His body was beginning to gain color. The wounds were healing slowly, but there was something in his gaze that remained opaque. He never looked at me for long, but when he did, there was something there that shattered me. It wasn't threat. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of regret that only exists in those who have seen too much, or in those who have done what they never should have. One morning I dreamed of Samuel. He was sitting on the porch of our childhood home, a glass of milk in his hands and his usual crooked smile. He said something I couldn't hear. Behind him, someone emerged from the shadows. A figure. And I woke before I knew who it was. The next morning I walked into the ward with shaking hands. Martin looked at me with that same weary gaze. And for a second I swear on everything I have left, I saw my brother inside him. Not in his features, but in his silence. The same kind of silence Sam used when he lied, when he hid something from me to protect me. And that's when I realized the name he gave me was just a curtain. The look, however, was real, and that terrified me more than any lie. It was by chance. It almost always is. The truth, in war and after it, never arrives head-on. It insinuates itself around corners, slips between the folds of everyday life, hides in small objects that no one notices, until they become unbearable to ignore. That morning I went to collect the dirty cloths from the abandoned wing. Martin was sleeping, turned on his side, his breathing shallower, as if dreaming of some childhood he no longer remembered. As I pulled the crumpled sheet from the floor, I felt something metallic tap against my ankle. I thought it was a button or a loose buckle, but when I bent down and picked it up, the world seemed to stop for a second. It was an identification bracelet, the kind soldiers wear on their wrists, with their name, number, and blood type. But this one was corroded at the edges, rusted at the corners. Time had erased almost everything. Almost. Because there, in the center, 3 letters were still engraved. Sam. My hands froze. My brother. Samuel Tillman. Sam. That's what everyone called him. That's how he signed his letters to me. Sam. I held the bracelet like someone holding an echo. The cold texture of the metal seemed to carry a weight that went beyond the object. It was as if it had been plucked from time and brought to me by some force I couldn't name. I sat on the floor, still holding the dirty cloth in one hand and the bracelet in the other. For a moment I thought I was hallucinating, but I wasn't. The weight was real. The silence in my chest was real. I looked at Martin. He was still asleep, or pretending to be, and I wondered, why was that bracelet there? Was it his? Had he found it somewhere? Having it with him? Was it a coincidence, or a memory, or a confession? I tucked the bracelet into my apron pocket and for the first time in weeks felt outside my own body. The ground beneath my feet felt hollow. The ward walls felt distant. The whole world had tilted slightly. Because that bracelet, in that place, at that moment, it couldn't be a coincidence. In the infirmary, there were hundreds of bracelets like this, but none with that name on them. And none that had been accidentally left in the path of someone who looked at me the way Martin did. That night, I placed the bracelet in the empty medicine chest and hid it under the loose floorboards in the dressing room, as if it were forbidden, as if hiding that object was the only way to protect what I didn't yet have the courage to understand. But it was too late. The symbol had already entered me, and from now on, every time Martin said my name, I would hear another one, older, deeper. I would hear Sam. To say Samuel was my brother would be an understatement. He was my guiding light, my grounding, my calmest blood. 4 years older than me, but it always seemed more so. Perhaps because from an early age, he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders with a patience that disconcerted me. When Dad died, it was Sam who held my hand at the wake, even with tears in his eyes. When Mom fell ill, it was he who stayed by her side until her last breath. And when the newspapers announced the boys would be drafted, it was he who enlisted before he was even called. "Better I go first than watch you watch me leave," he said. And he smiled, that crooked, slightly sad smile that seemed to know the end before it began. I still remember the last letter I received from him. The precisely folded paper, the firm handwriting, the words too simple to hide what he truly meant. He spoke of the cold, of the nights he heard the screams of others, of a new sergeant who trusted no one. But what struck me most was a phrase that, at the time, seemed purely melancholy. Some men here are not what they seem, and the enemy is not always on the other side. When he was declared missing in action, I knew I'd never see that smile again. I didn't need confirmation. It was a different kind of silence, one you only feel between siblings. It was as if my body had heard the news before it arrived. The pain came dry. No tears. A weight on the back of my neck. A muffled sound behind my eyes. I spent the next few days like someone wading through a swamp. Unsteady. Aimless. It was only then that I decided to go. To be a nurse. To throw myself into the chaos that took him. as if there I could, somehow, understand him, or perhaps touch him again, in the hands of another man. And now, decades later, there I was, standing before a stranger named Martin, with an identification bracelet engraved with Sam, hidden in my pocket, with a look that hurt me in a place I thought I was already dead, and with the kind of silence only brothers know. I began to pay attention to his gestures, the way he slept on his side, his hand under his head, just like Sam slept on summer afternoons on our porch. The way he cleared his throat before speaking, the way Sam did when trying to hide an emotion, even the way he said my name. There was something there, a hesitation that cut through, as if he said Geneva with the memory of someone who had heard that name before. Doubt gnawed at me, but my heart was already beating at a different pace, and for the first time I wished it was all just my imagination, that it was just a delirium of longing. But deep down I already knew that man wasn't just a wounded man. He was part of my story, and maybe of the tragedy that took my brother away. There are things memory can't invent. It can mix up dates, names, addresses. It can change the order of tragedies and erase the details of joy. But there are gestures that remain embedded in the body, like an old song you sing without knowing why, like the smell of burnt coffee that takes you, unintentionally, back to your childhood home, like hands. Sam's hands were firm but long. There was a curl to his fingers that he hated. They said they looked like a pianist's fingers, but he wanted to be a hunter. His nails were always clean. His palms were warm. The way he picked things up was unique, a little too slowly, as if respecting the object before touching it. And on that freezing night as I carried the bowl of soup to Martin, I saw it. I saw the gesture, the precise way he held the spoon, the long fingers, the slightly inward curving thumb, the hesitation before the first bite. I froze. That wasn't a common movement. It was familiar, ancient. My body recognized it before I did. I sat silently beside him. I pretended to be distracted by the steam from the food, the creaking of the window. But my eyes wouldn't leave him. When he finished, he set the spoon down on the cloth and rested his hands in his lap. I stared at them. The veins, the joints, even the way he habitually curled his right index finger, as if it were always waiting for a warning. It was Sam. No error him, I knew. But those hands, they held the memory of him, the trace, the silent language of coexistence. My heart began to beat faster, not with love, nor with fear, but with recognition, as if my body were screaming something that my mind still refused to accept. I got up, making excuses to get more blankets, but I went straight to the storage room, entered, locked the door, and sank to my knees on the cold floor. My breath hitched, my hands trembled. I looked at them, my own hands, as if to see if they were clean. But they weren't. I had touched him. I had cared for him. I had allowed him. I allowed someone who might have been connected to Sam's death to occupy my silence, my time, my affection. I allowed the past to sneak in and sit beside me, eating my soup, sleeping under my coat. I allowed it without knowing, and now, knowing was worse. Back in the ward, I found Martin sleeping. His hands rested on his chest as if protecting something or someone. I stood there, watching, not daring to wake him, not daring to ask, because the answer, maybe it was already in my memories. And that night I dreamed of Sam again. But this time his hands were stained, and when he tried to touch me, I recoiled. I woke up crying. In the orphanage's main room, a picture frame, grimy with age, hangs crookedly on the wall of the old chapel. The frame is thick, gilded with worn arabesques, and a chip in the top corner. It has always gone unnoticed by those who didn't live there. But I always knew what it contained. An old faded photograph, taken in a muddy field days before the attack that took my brother. It was the only image left of Sam in uniform. That afternoon, driven by something I would still call courage if it didn't hurt so much, I walked to the chapel. Each step echoed inside my own chest. The dust on the ground marked my feet, as if the past were recognizing me. I stood there, in front of the portrait, breathing in the ancient scent of cold wax and damp wood. Sam's eyes stared at me with that grave serenity only he possessed. Behind him, half faded, stood 5 other soldiers. None of them smiled. It was a picture of men too tired to pose. Each face bore the mark of someone who had already lost much, and would lose more. I slowly scanned each one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the 5th, something froze me. The face was partially shadowed, but the cut across the eyebrow was clear. The same cut, the same tilt of the head, the same look of someone who didn't want to be there, but knew it was too late to back out. It was him, or someone so absurdly similar to Martin that any coincidence became impossible. I put my hand to the glass, as if I could pass through it. My fingers trembled. My eyes searched for something to confirm or deny. But all I found was that silence only photographs know. The kind of silence that screams. I returned to the room and took the box where I'd kept the bracelet from the floor. I held it with the same hand I'd used to touch the portrait. Sam was still there. Now, between the cold metal and the black and white image, there was a bridge, and it passed through me entirely. I knelt beside the bed. I didn't pray. I didn't cry. I just stood there, as if that gesture were the only one possible when one is between 2 ghosts, one who died, the other who might have been the reason. I began to wonder if Martin knew that photo existed, if he knew who Sam was, if that cut on his eyebrow was really a coincidence or a scar left by the very moment that took my brother from me. And most of all, I wondered if he knew I was Sam's sister. Why did he let me save him? Or worse, did he leave it on purpose? A few days after I stared at that photograph, Martin began to speak less. His eyes avoided mine. He ate in silence, went to bed early, and pretended not to hear when I asked how he felt. It was as if an invisible weight had settled over us both, and by mutual instinct, neither of us dared break. But what is kept silent rots from within, and I began to smell the truth. It was a windy night. The windows rattled loudly, and the ward's torn cloth swayed like a candle about to go out. Martin was feverish again. His forehead burned, his lips cracked. I prepared a damp cloth and carefully laid him down. I sat beside the bed. The lampshade cast long shadows on the wall, the same shadows that seemed to have been following us for weeks. He began to mumble in his sleep, disjointed words like fragments of memories ripped from a nightmare. I leaned my ear close to his face. It wasn't supposed to be him. Sam. He ran. My hand tightened on the sheet. My name wasn't there, but my brother's name was. I remained silent. I didn't wake him. I just sat there. The tears began to fall slowly, one after the other, as if my body was finally accepting what my soul already knew. I didn't need to hear any more. Those few words were enough to paint the whole picture, even if there were missing brushstrokes. The next morning he woke up without a fever. He looked at me. For the first time, his eyes fixed on mine. He didn't look away. And in that look, there was everything. Guilt, dread, gratitude, a pain that not even 1,000 words could describe. I sat on the edge of the bed and held his hand. He didn't pull away. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to lie. He knew. I knew. And neither of us said anything. It was a silent pact, an invisible contract. The kind of bond war forges between two survivors on opposing sides. Or on the same side, just at different times. And I understood. The killer doesn't always carry a gun. Sometimes they just carry a memory. And sometimes, forgiveness begins when you decide you've suffered enough trying to understand. That night, the wind stopped, and the silence inside me changed color. In war, the hardest choices rarely come with fanfare. They don't explode like bombs or wail like sirens. They arrive slowly. They drag on. And often they come disguised as routine. That morning, shortly after breakfast, I was called into the supervisor's office. She was a stern, dry woman, with eyes like someone who had buried too much hope to be moved. On the desk were some papers, the updated patient list, medication circulation reports, and a form I hadn't written. A wounded soldier was seen leaving the decommissioned wing, she said without looking up. I don't know, I replied, with a calm that I didn't even know I had. They say he wasn't registered, that he has no number, no name. Silence. My heart was pounding, but on the outside, I was stone. Are you sure you're not covering for someone, Tillman? She asked. The word covering up stung. It was too heavy. It carried crime, betrayal, desertion. It carried everything a nurse shouldn't be. But in that moment, I realized what I was doing wasn't covering up. It was guarding. It was keeping alive what could no longer be undone. It must have been a mistake, I said. I can investigate if you want. She looked at me for a few seconds. Long. Deep. Then she nodded. Do it, and be honest. War has enough lies as it is. I returned to the ward with cold hands and frozen blood. I found Martin making the bed, or at least trying to. He was standing stronger but still heavy with memories. When he saw me, he froze. Do they know? He asked. I nodded slowly. Someone saw you. We don't have much time. He took a deep breath, as if he already knew that moment would come. Do you want me to go? The question was fair, but the answer never was. You're not going anywhere, I whispered. You're going to leave here a survivor, like everyone else. I prepared the paperwork. I printed out a random name, a fictitious origin. I filled out the form with details I'd invented with the precision of someone who'd always dealt with fake lives trying to save real ones. I declared him a civilian, rescued from a destroyed village. No identification, no family, no priors, just injured. I took the documents to the administrative office, handing them over with the same hand that held Sam's bracelet. And when I signed them in my own handwriting, I realized it was the first time I'd officially lied since I'd set foot in that hospital. Hours later, Martin was evacuated to a secure base. He wore clean clothes. He walked with difficulty. He never looked back. And I stood there, with the dirty sheet in my hands, and the silence exploding in my chest. Because in that moment, I understood that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's carrying on. And protecting. Even when everything inside you screams for justice, she was there, forever. And yet, as new, a card by Sam. I kept it for years without the courage to open it, partly out of fear of what I would find, but perhaps even more so, out of fear of what now would find. No final words, no goodbyes, no answers, just the silence between the lines. And that I don't know if I could bear. But that morning, with the sun slicing through the room at the same angle it had so many years ago, my bones aching from the weight of everything I'd told him, I knew it was time. My hands no longer trembled from old age. They trembled from truth. I sat on the edge of the iron bed, the mattress sinking beneath my thin body. The envelope, brown and rough, seemed warmed by an ancient expectation. I carefully broke the ribbon, as if dispelling a spell, and began to read. The handwriting was his. I could recognize it even with my eyes closed. It was like hearing his voice again, that direct tone, slightly tinged with melancholy. Sam wrote as if he knew time was short. Geez, if I don't come back, know that it was because I trusted too much. His chest tightened. There's a guy here who bothers me. Not because of what he says, but because of what he hides. He was from another division, transferred without warning. He carries a heavy silence, something between what he saw and what he did. And yesterday, when I told him about you, about your idea of enlisting, he looked at me in a way I can't explain, as if he already knew you, as if he knew you were coming. My stomach turned. If something happens to me, G, remember this. Sometimes the threat doesn't come from far away. Sometimes it's sleeping right next to us. The letter didn't end with love, or goodbye. It ended with a short sentence, a hard full stop. Beware of those who survive too long. They always carry the dead inside. I closed the letter with trembling hands. The world around me fell completely silent. Not even the wall clock seemed to make a sound. Martin. Martin had heard my name from Sam's lips. Maybe on the verge of death. Maybe in their last conversation. And he carried that name with him, all the way to me, all the way to the hospital, all the way to the stretcher where I saved him, where I welcomed him. It was there that I understood, with the cruel clarity of late truths. He knew who I was before I knew who he was. It took me a while to get out of bed after reading the letter. Sam's words still vibrated inside me, as if each sentence had wormed its way into my bones. The room felt smaller, the light harsher, even the air thicker. Sometimes when the truth hits us, it doesn't scream. It just weighs. I went back to the box. I pulled out the torn piece of newspaper that I had circled with blue ink years ago. I remember finding it by chance at a flea market in Pittsburgh. The name caught my eye. Martin A. Gellert. The text was short, a standard obituary. It said he had died quietly, far from his family. No mention of the war, no recognition. But for some reason I kept it. At the time I didn't know why. But now it made perfect sense. I also picked up the bracelet. Sam still gleamed on the oxidized metal. A relic that had escaped time. A memento that never asked to be found. The final confirmation came in a clandestine military file I'd kept since the 1950s, obtained by a former doctor who worked with me. Suspicious of Martin, he investigated on his own, but never showed me the results. When he died, his belongings came to me, and among them was the file, forged, altered. But on the back, handwritten, was a sentence. Gellert was there. He was the last person to see him. The handwriting was the doctor's, the chart was Martin's, and the name Sam was crossed out in one corner. 3 thin lines. 3 lines. 3 lives that crossed in silence. I sat on the floor with all the objects in front of me. The letter, the newspaper, the bracelet, the file. A circle of evidence I never asked for, but which reached me as if time itself wanted me to know. Martin was the man. The last to see Sam. The last to hear him speak. Maybe the last to touch him. Maybe whoever killed him, whether by order, by mistake, by panic, it doesn't matter anymore. Not now. What matters is that I saved him. I washed his body. I sewed his flesh. I fed his fever. I hid him from the world. I protected him from the brother he had destroyed. What if I knew before? Maybe I would have let him die. But finding out later is worse. Because now I can't unsave. I can't unremember. I can't unbe the woman who saw a broken man and chose to believe he still deserved to live. Martin died years later, alone, anonymous. And yet, my name was the last he said. Geneva, the name he heard from Sam himself, in a muddy field, days before the last photograph. Now everything is back in the box. The folded letter, the bracelet covered in a linen cloth, the yellowed newspaper resting like a scar. I stored everything as one would prepare a body for rest, with care, with respect, with a pain that doesn't bleed, but weighs heavily. The orphanage is silent tonight. The wind doesn't sing, just slips through the cracks in the windows. And I, sitting in the armchair beside the iron bed, stare at the sealed envelope that now remains, only as a symbol. It has already been opened, but its pain has not yet dissipated. My fingers caress the blue handkerchief I carry in my dress pocket, the same one I wore the day Sam left. It's faded, the fabric is thin, but it still smells like her, of soap, of home, of a childhood that will never return. You know, I spent my life believing that good and evil were opposite paths, that all you had to do was choose one and follow it. But war, and what it leaves inside us, taught me that sometimes they walk side by side, that the man you save may have killed the only one you loved, and yet your hand still moves to help him, without knowing it. The question I get asked sometimes, when I tell parts, when I gloss over details, is, would you have done differently if you had known who he was? And I still don't know, because in that moment he wasn't an enemy. He was a trembling body, a gaze that demanded silence, a wound that needed me, and maybe, just maybe, he was also carrying too much regret to be able to die. And in the end, that's what stays with me. The idea that I saved a man who took my brother, and that, even so, perhaps I was the only person who saw him as a whole person. I open the box again. I take out the bracelet. I place it on my palm. The metal is cold, but it hurts like fire. Alone. The word doesn't come out loud. It just vibrates inside. 3 letters, 3 fingers, 3 paths that crossed where they shouldn't have. A line that should never have been drawn, but once drawn, shaped the rest of my life. I close the box. I lock it with tape. I put it under the bed. And I remain silent. How he became, how I was, as perhaps you are now. And if this story touched you, comment where you're listening to me from. Just so I know how far this secret has gone, and tell me, what would you have done?